Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. We can forget about being on the verge of a generational moment in our country's history because as we meet today, this afternoon, we are living it. Donald Trump is now a once indicted, twice impeached, forever disgraced ex-president, and he's expected to surrender to law enforcement in New York early next week. We understand it will happen on Tuesday. Although there was some misinformation, confusion this morning, Trump's attorney told NBC News earlier that the office of the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who's overseeing this case, wanted Trump to turn himself in today. That lawyer, Joe Tacopina, insisted that Secret Service needed more time to, quote, prepare. We should tell you our reporting does not support that assertion that he made. Sources within the Secret Service told our colleague Julia Ainsley that Trump's detail could be ready to transport Trump at a moment's notice. So there's a lot of information swirling. There's a lot of news developing this hour. We're going to take you through all of it with our favorite reporters and friends. There's this news that Donald Trump is expected to fly into New York Monday night. He will turn himself in the next morning, Tuesday. That's according to the latest from NBC's Jonathan Dienst. We're not expecting DA Bragg to unseal the indictment until Trump actually appears in court. But we can report this afternoon that according to two sources familiar with the matter, it lists 30 counts of document fraud related charges. Our legal friends are all here today to help us understand what that might mean. As for the DA, we saw Alvin Bragg earlier today flanked by security walking into the office. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, described as seeking to project confidence right now, is predictably on the attack, not just targeting Alvin Bragg, but targeting Alvin Bragg's wife, along with other lawyers involved in this case. And interestingly, the judge. And, he sent out half a dozen fundraising emails since the news broke yesterday. Of course he has. Of course it should be top of mind for him and us that this is just the beginning. Alvin Bragg's investigation is only one of 4 current active investigations into Donald Trump. So it just might be the case that days like this are about to become less historic, less extraordinary. It's where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Someone who knows the details of this case probably better than most of us. New York Times investigative reporter Susanne is here. Also joining us, Andrew Weissmann, former Justice Department prosecutor, former senior member of Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation. We haven't let him out of that chair since you saw him here yesterday. Plus, the editor-at-large of The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes, is back with us. And with us on set, Mike Schmidt, New York Times Washington correspondent. Lucky for us, they are all MSNBC contributors. Susanne Craig, I feel like in our conversations, in every attempt that we've made to understand what is behind the legal moves, what the documents tell us, you have always sought to caution or warn us that this could be bigger than the Stormy Daniels payments. And it seems that some of the tea leaves suggest it may also include payments to Karen McDougal. Talk about what you see in the tea leaves and what we know is in the documents.
So we know that there are, and there's been a lot of reporting at the New York Times and other places that this is going to include a number of potential felony counts. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to expand beyond the Stormy Daniels hush money payment. These all could be connected, but it could include, something to do with Karen McDougal. And again, I always get nervous when I'm on TV and you don't know. But I did go back and I was looking through Michael Cohen's first book today. I've been looking the last couple of days, reading it and going over it. And he has just this fascinating exchange that he recounts that he had with Alan Weisselberg when the hush money payment was made. They have to come up with $130,000 in the first instance. It was interesting. Alan Weisselberg's like, I'm not going to front this. And then they had to figure out, once Michael Cohen said, okay, I'm going to go take the home equity loan, I'm going to do it. Alan Weisselberg looks at him and they have a conversation about where should they try and kind of put the invoice. And one of the suggestions was, well, let's maybe lay it off at the LA golf course. And then Alan says, well, do you know anybody that might want to, for example, buy a Mar-a-Lago membership, and we can maybe do it that way? There was sort of all these interesting suggestions that Weisselberg had that go to the falsification. And I think we're going to probably see some of that in the indictment. There's a lot of ways that you can get money to somebody. For example, in the case of Donald Trump, you could you could ask somebody just to book a whole bunch of hotel rooms at his place and not show up and get him money that way. This doesn't necessarily lead to, you can have a falsification of a business record without tax fraud. But one thing I just would be very fascinated by on whenever, I don't know if it's going to be Tuesday, but when the indictment does come out, does this sort of veer into tax fraud? Did they falsify the business record and then go to the tax man with it, and will there be a state charge there? I think the IRS hopefully would be interested in that as well. It seems like they're not interested in a lot what Donald Trump does, but I'd be curious to see, if we do get a tax crime here as well. It's not necessarily going to happen, but it could happen.
That's so interesting. I mean, and you and I have asked the question, where has the IRS been? It also comes as we learn that Trump is very interested in sicking the IRS on his political adversaries. To your point, we did a little bit of this homework as well and looked at what we knew about how and where the plans were hatched to structure the hush money payments. And I have two things I want to share. This is Cohen testifying under oath about Trump's role in it. Let me play this first.
Yeah. In 2016, prior to the election, I was contacted by Keith Davidson, who is the attorney, or was the attorney for Miss Clifford, for Stormy Daniels. And after several rounds of conversations with him about purchasing her life rights for $130,000, what I did each and every time is go straight into Mr. Trump's office and discuss the issue with him. When it was ultimately determined, and this was days before the election, that Mr. Trump was going to pay the $130,000. In the office with me was Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. He acknowledged to Alan that he was going to pay the $130,000 and that Alan and I should go back to his office and figure out how to do it.
I mean, just to all that has been in front of our very eyes for a very long time, no one's ever refuted Trump's role in this. The Southern District of New York puts in writing Trump is the coordinator and director of the hush money scheme involving both women. I mean, this isn't in dispute. And I wonder what you make of what lies ahead in terms of Trump is a master at fogging up the mirror of what we already know to be established facts.
Right. And I keep thinking you can't have it both ways. You can't, A, not know, and then B, has spent your entire life saying you're involved in every aspect of the company down to every check that has been signed. He has been saying that since he was, a day out of Wharton Business School and starting at his father's company, that he was intricately involved in everything, to the point where, he erased his father's role pretty much in the building of his own, of his own company. So I think that's going to be one thing is, he always, when things happen, he's always like, I don't know that person. I didn't do that. And I think this is just catching up with him.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. Andrew Weissmann, let me go back and just let's spend some time in the time capsule in terms of things that have been established. This is Trump and Cohen in their own voices. This is a recording. And again, it gets to the structuring and Trump's role in designing the financial structures for paying hush money to women with whom he had affairs. Hello to the barking dog. Let me play this for you, Andrew.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David, so that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with
So what are we going to pay?
Funding. Yes. And it's all the stuff, because you never know where that company, you never know where he's going to be.
Gets hit by it.
Correct. So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be.
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
I'll pay the cash.
No.
I mean, I've watched enough mob movies to know that innocent people don't utter this sentence, quote, pay with cash. Andrew Weissmann, what are we entering into if this goes to trial, as Trump has said he plans for it to be the path he takes?
So, this is one where obviously Michael Cohen is a difficult witness. He is really not your ideal government witness for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that he's still talking, and that differentiates him from anybody who I've ever dealt with as a cooperating witness. But that being said, these are really experienced state prosecutors. They've been in this territory. This is their bread and butter, doing these kinds of cases. And this particular case, not that complicated. And so this case is going to be, I think, as Susanne sort of mentioned, is I think really going to be made on documents. And that tape recording is one where there are a number of ways that can be used, not just for the fact that you have Donald Trump himself on tape saying, obviously, who sits there instead of paying cash? If it was legit, you'd be like, I'm going to wire him the money or I'm going to send him a check. I mean, it just makes no sense. But the fact that Michael Cohen was taping it shows that Michael Cohen is not going to tape record it as somebody who's going to say, what are you talking about? I don't know anything about this. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. And that's not what you hear. What you hear is, wait a second, pay in cash. I mean, so the very fact of the tape recording is something that the DA's office knows to use very well to corroborate Michael Cohen. And then just one small caveat, which is, Donald Trump has not had his day in court in a criminal case. So it is true that there has been no refutation by Donald Trump. We have a lot of adjectives. We have a lot of adverbs. We have a lot of epithets about the DA and the case. But that's not an argument. That is not a fact. That is not any legal argument that's been made. But he will have a place where he can do that. But so far, I totally agree with you. We have just a lot of adjectives masquerading as some kind of factual or legal refutation, and we haven't heard anything to refute this. And I do think one of the things the media gets wrong is to sort of cover adjectives and adverbs as if it's anything. It's literally nothing more than the paper it's printed on.
So we will have a hard ban on adverbs around here in honor of you, Andrew Weissmann. I want to read something. I don't want to start with this, but we are going to spend some time today just exploring the sort of political response to the evidence amassed by Alvin Bragg. We've talked a lot, you and I, again, on and off TV, about his reluctance to pick up and pursue this case with vigor. He has done just that. But I do want to talk about the investigators who came before Alvin Bragg, because I think Republicans don't want anyone to know this. But the Southern District of New York found this, quote, during the campaign, Michael Cohen played a central role in two similar schemes to purchase the rights to stories, each from women who claimed to have had an affair with individual one, Donald Trump, so as to suppress the stories and thereby prevent them from influencing the election. With respect to both payments, Michael Cohen acted with the intent to influence the 2016 presidential election. Cohen coordinated his actions with one or more members of the campaign, including through meetings and phone calls about the fact, nature, and timing of the payments. In particular, and as Michael Cohen himself has now admitted, with respect to both payments, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, Donald J. Trump. My question, Andrew, is whether we can assume that this line, so the Southern District of New York investigated and found this. Michael Cohen coordinated his actions with one or more members of the campaign, including through meetings and phone calls, about the fact, nature, and timing of the payments. These are the people, some of them, who were in before Alvin Bragg's grand jury. They include Hope Hicks, they include Kellyanne Conway, they include David Pecker and others. Are we to assume that Alvin Bragg matched the investigative approach of SDNY, albeit while pursuing evidence to support crimes other than federal campaign finance violations?
Absolutely. I would think that the federal case that you're outlining is a subset of the work that was done by the DA's office, because remember, we know from Jeff Berman's book that the Attorney General Barr, put a kibosh on pursuing that case after Michael Cohen pleaded guilty. And to your point, Michael Cohen admitted this was a crime. His defense lawyer viewed this as a crime. The prosecutors in the Southern District viewed this as a crime. The federal judge overseeing the case accepted the plea as a crime, didn't say this is not a crime. And importantly, the general counsel of the Federal Election Committee viewed this as a crime. So the claim now by Donald Trump that he didn't think this was a crime is he's going to have a court of law where he can make that argument, and we'll see how that fares. But there is a record now, which, as you say, Nicolle, so far is undisputed. There's no factual or legal basis that's been set out as to why this is not a crime.
Is there anything that stops Merrick Garland from, once these crimes have been charged in state court, looking at this case? Or is there any obligation to answer why, after Bill Barr was long gone, nothing was ever done with facts and evidence that are strong enough for Bragg to have brought his own case?
So on the first question, there is something called the Pettit policy, where what that is intended to do is to not have duplicative federal and state charges. It's a DOJ policy where before you would have so-called duplicative charges, you would examine whether it really makes sense and is there some separate federal interest that needs to be vindicated. Here, where you do have a state charge going forward, you could imagine the feds not doing it. I think more importantly is I do think that it is important to know why the current Attorney General did not go forward. Like Susanne, I have the same issue with respect to why there are no tax charges, federal tax charges. As you recall, in the Trump Organization charges, I have never seen a state case in an indictment, and then Letitia James in her civil complaint. They screamed out over and over again that these are federal crimes, not just state crimes. When Alan Weisselberg pleaded guilty, his guilty plea, his allocution was that these were state and federal tax crimes. To Suzanne's point, this is really her expertise. So I've never seen the state so loudly call out that this warrants federal prosecution, and we have seen nothing at the federal level. I do think that, as we've talked about, Jack Smith has a lot on his plate, and this doesn't directly go within his remit, but it would be nice to know what in God's green earth were they doing and what, if anything, are they doing? Because it really does seem like this is one where they dropped the ball.
Well, and I guess the reason I keep, I think Tim Miller called me a dog with a bone on this, is that the disinformation campaign that will dominate the conversation on the right will be predicated on the fact, well, actually, let's do Joe Tacopina for 500. Let me show you what he's spinning to the 25% of the country that is primed to accept the spin from Trump's side.
We do know it centers around, a legal, very common confidentiality agreement that was signed years and years ago with Stormy Daniels and between her attorneys and Michael Cohen. The only other precedent that's even remotely close is the John Edwards case, which was prosecuted by federal authorities because it was a federal election. It was prosecuted because there was a donor involved as opposed to using personal funds like here. Somehow a state prosecutor who doesn't even have jurisdiction over the federal elections is prosecuting a case. This was a personal resolution for a personal matter that would have been made irrespective of the campaign.
This, Mike Schmidt, is the Melania would have been mad defense. And it may make sense in their personal life. I wouldn't know. But it's not rooted in any reality. And the differentiator with the Edwards case isn't the donor's role. It's the benefit to the campaign. I mean, this is I guess this incorporates enough real big words for the Trump side to carry some water on the right, but that's not why Trump wasn't prosecuted. As Andrew just said, the campaign finance case isn't brought for reasons. The most we know about it is from Jeff Berman's book, that a lot of pressure came to bear.
In 2005, the prescient New York Times said that Joe Tacopina was to the legal community what Donald Trump is to the real estate community.
No, why?
Because Joe Tacopina is very similar to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has long searched for the lawyers that will do what he wants him to do.
Yeah.
And at times he's found those lawyers, and at times people have gone along with what he wanted, and at times not. But this is someone who really fits the bill. And there's a very glaring and important story about Joe Tacopina that could give us some idea of how this is going to go forward. Back, 6 or 7 years ago, he represented another person who was very similar to Trump, who was impervious to the facts, and was under investigation. That was Alex Rodriguez, the baseball slugger. And in the course of that investigation that was done by Major League Baseball, Tacopina didn't just try and defend Alex Rodriguez. He led a legal team that tried to destroy Major League Baseball, with Alex Rodriguez as his client going along with this. They paid for protesters to stand outside the stadium. They had private investigators trying to talk to the caddies of the current commissioner, Rob Manfred's, from his golf course. They went to really extraordinary lengths to do everything they could to pull the sport down with them. And obviously, a Manhattan DA's investigation is different than a Major League Baseball investigation, but he went to extraordinary lengths. This was not just a defense lawyer who was really trying to defend his client. This was a defense lawyer who was trying to destroy the organization that was trying to hold Alex Rodriguez accountable.
So extrapolate that over what we should be girding ourselves for as he now represents Donald Trump, who's already reposting menacing pictures with images of violence. You've got Lindsey Graham with some unbelievably reckless tweets this morning about violence toward law enforcement. I mean, what does that portend to have this toxic combustion between Joe Tacopina and Donald Trump?
I mean, it was the first thing that I thought about, and I called, someone in baseball who had dealt with this today to sort of just check, say, I remember Tacopina being involved, and it, this, it's a really important sort of story that gives us some sense of where this could be headed. And we've seen Trump do obviously extraordinary things with his lawyers and try to get his lawyers to do that. But to Andrew's point, this will really be the first time that he's in court. So what will that look like? We had some of that with the fight that went on over the documents down in Florida with the special master and the judge who initially sided with Trump. But what will Donald Trump in court look like? Will he continue this type of behavior? Will the judge have to step in and try and put a gag order in to try and tamp things down? We're headed into a very unexpected and different area where we're going to see Trump. This is not like impeachment where the Republicans then get to go and redirect the narrative back to how they want it. It's a whole different ballgame.
I want to press on this, this door that's been opened here. I guess Mike goes to baseball, I go to dating. I mean, the idea that any of these lawyers think they're going to be different. They're going to be the one. They're going to be the one that doesn't have to hire a lawyer themselves. They're going to be the one that Trump listens to. They're going to be the one that gets him out of trouble is a whole pathology that I think we should probe a little bit. No one's going anywhere. When we come back, we'll have that conversation. Plus, we'll bring you up to date on the other threads that we've only touched on. There used to be a time when a criminal indictment would sink a normal politician's presidential candidacy. Because it's Trump and because it's 2023, that may no longer be the case, not in Trump's Republican Party. We'll talk about the party's reaction, their reflexes to the disgraced ex-president. And later in the show, lightning rods on the far right are calling for protests in the streets of my hometown of New York City as security and local officials are bracing for the possibility of violence. A tense and scary situation just under 24 hours since the news first broke of Trump's indictment. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
Hi, I'm Jen Psaki. I know from the years I've spent on campaign buses, in foreign capitals, and in the Oval Office, that there is always more to a story under the surface. On my new show on MSNBC, we're going to bring you inside all of it, breaking down the truth about the things that matter and visiting with some of the most fascinating people in the news today. So I hope you join me every Sunday at noon Eastern on MSNBC for Inside with Jen Psaki.
An embarrassment of riches in terms of experts. Susanne Craig, Andrew Weissmann, Charlie Sykes, and Mike Schmidt are still with us. So Charlie Sykes, pick up on Mr. Tacopina. I'm reminded that he was Bernie Kerik's attorney before Bernie Kerik ended up going to prison. It is a dicey, a roll of the dice to have a lawyer like this at a moment that is dicey for the country, but it's so on brand. It seems like an obvious choice for Trump.
No, it does seem like an obvious choice. And I want to pick up with on something that both Andrew and Mike were emphasizing. The rules have changed now. Donald Trump has spent years throwing out the adjectives and the slurs aimed at prosecutors, insulting judges. But next week, this will be the first time that Donald Trump is insulting a judge who is presiding over a felony trial. The rules have changed when Donald Trump is now a defendant in a trial like this. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because, as Andrew points out, it's one thing for him to put out statements with, lots of adjectives and lots of verbiage that don't mean anything at all. But now he's in a court of law where his freedom is at risk, where truth actually will matter. And so having lawyers like the lawyers he's chosen who are given to making the comments they make, it's one thing to go on cable television and say these things. It's a very different thing when you're standing in front of a judge. And I don't know whether or not the judge is going to sit up there on the bench and read the statements. Mr. Trump, did you actually say that I hate your guts? Mr. Trump, did you actually use this language to describe the prosecution? I don't know whether or not they will challenge him on that, but it's a completely different environment for him right now. Because we've now moved from the strictly political celebrity, circus aspect of this to a court of law, a very serious court of law.
Well, and Charlie, again, because it's Trump, there are so many patterns that we can reflect back on. I mean, judges have not been as daunted by Trump's political superpowers as Republican senators and members of Congress have been by him, and even some members of his own cabinet. I mean, I think you had a federal judge was the first to say that Donald Trump and John Eastman likely committed felonies. Right. Many of the judges looking at the 1-6 cases have said out loud in courtrooms and in filings that Donald Trump continues to create a climate where the recidivism is a high risk for the insurrectionists because he keeps telling the lies that incited them in the first place. I mean, it's also a place that hasn't been as cowed by Trump and Trumpism as the other branches of government.
No, I mean, a lot of his legal strategy seems to have been aimed at deterrence, at intimidating the prosecutors and the juries from taking any action. And now he's going to be waging this two-front war, and they're going to be in tension with one another. His political appeal, which will be to keep throwing red meat to gin up the base, is in conflict with the much more sober and restricted message that he's going to have in trial. It's going to be interesting to see how he finesses that, particularly going forward. But I will also say, you made a point at the beginning of the program. This is just the beginning, and it is just the beginning. And it's going to be a long spring and a long summer with, perhaps more indictments dropping. But I think that in terms of politics, the die is cast, and that you've seen that Republicans have decided that they are going to go all in on Trump. And if they're all in on this indictment, well, they bought the ticket for the next two as well. If there's an indictment out of Georgia, they're going to have to say the same thing because they've already bought in. If there are indictments involving January 1st. So this is what, there are things that we don't know. We don't know what's in the sealed indictment. But what we do know is that the Republican Party has decided that it is not going to take an off-ramp once again, that it is not going to distance themselves, and that they are going to now spend the next year and a half answering questions about this man and about his conduct. And there's no way now for them to step back and say, OK, this was terrible what happened in New York, but boy, we need to keep our powder dry when it comes to Jack Smith or when it comes to his attempt to overturn the election in Georgia. They're in. And we know that. And I think that's been determined over the last 36 hours.
Well, and if you pull that thread out, Charlie, it requires the Republicans to do something they've proven they're willing and capable of doing, and that is sounding asinine to the voters. They're going to say that there was some clubhouse meeting between prosecutors in New York, Fulton County, and D.C. Right. The guy was at The Hague when it started, and they all decided to conspire. I mean, it will require them to be pro-hush money payments to porn stars, pro-insurrection, pro-classified documents sitting around at Mar-a-Lago. But you're right. That's where they're heading.
No, that's right. So you're going to have a Republican Party that is going to increasingly sound like Trump's social media threads. And so, look, I do think I agree with the conventional wisdom that suggests that this probably will boost Donald Trump's Republican primary prospects, that this will be good for Trump politically in the short run. But long run, this is a worst case scenario for Republicans who now are going to have to live with this and are going to have to repeat these lines. They're going to be asked every single day, what about the latest slur that Donald Trump puts out? What about the appeals to violence? If there is any sort of violence, what are they going to say about it? So if Republicans thought that they were going to be able to talk about inflation or other things, they basically mortgaged their entire agenda now to going along with what is about to happen to Donald Trump again.
Andrew Weissmann, is there any, I think Charlie lays out this tension that hasn't existed for Trump, where if he wants the cheeseburger, he can't have the 32-inch waist, right? We know he doesn't make those calculations at the golf club buffet. But if he wants to juice the base, he may not stay out of trouble with the judge. I know a lot of folks have asked you about Roger Stone, who wanted to juice the base, but ultimately faced a consequence in court. Could Donald Trump face the same consequence? And how much sort of running room will a judge give Donald Trump?
So I think that's a fascinating question because I had a couple of thoughts. First, when you think about Donald Trump and what he was facing in the Mueller probe, he was still the president. So he had a lot of levers short of violence and the bully pulpit to incite violence. He had the pardon power. He had the ability to fire us. He had a willing AG to threaten prosecutions. And he had a lot of tools at his disposal to obstruct and to avoid criminal accountability, not the least of which is a sitting president could not be indicted by the Department of Justice under its internal policy, not by law, by internal policy. He doesn't have those now. And so he is going to find himself in the same situation as Roger Stone, who parenthetically, I was quite struck by Roger Stone's outward bravado, seemingly much like Donald Trump. And in court, I mean, you actually could feel that he was, as any defendant could be and would be, really scared. He had that look, and he in court had none of that puffery and boasting sort of swagger. You got the idea that he understood there were criminal consequences. Well, now Donald Trump doesn't have an ally in the White House. He doesn't have those levers. And that's why you see this call to violence. You saw it on January 6th as he was his sinking ship. It was his last resort. And you're seeing it now. And the court does have the power to prevent all of this. He is not free with no restrictions. He will be a defendant out on bail. If he commits a crime, including soliciting, inciting, harassing of anyone, witnesses, jurors, prosecutors, the judge, in the way that Roger Stone did with respect to the judge overseeing his case, he can find himself not just with restrictions on what he can and cannot say in social media to protect people. He could find himself facing additional charges, if not also back in jail. So he is going to be in a very different situation at a time when he doesn't have a lot of levers other than this resort to violence.
Susanne, I want to come back to the sum and substance of what we don't know, the full body of what was presented to the grand jury, but we know that a lot of the documents tell the story. Mark Pomerantz writes about it. Michael Cohen's testified to it. This is the full list of people we know were before this grand jury in the final weeks. Kellyanne Conway, Hope Hicks, Jeffrey McConney, he's the Trump org controller, David Pecker, the National Enquirer publisher at the time, Dylan Howard, also a former top editor from the National Enquirer at the time, Keith Davidson, who is Stormy Daniels' lawyer. When you match what is sort of in black and white, the kinds of, albeit sordid and dodgy structural arrangements like the ones we heard Michael Cohen and Trump talking about hashing out in Allen's office, and you look at the people that had to come in and tell the truth about what they knew. The story is it's not a stretch, right? And when you look at how close to the line, I mean, the bombshell that was your reporting was just how close to the line Trump, from almost infancy to the presidency, walked when it came to the law, way over the line on ethics, but in terms of the law. But I wonder what you think in terms of how much there ultimately was to present to a grand jury in terms of the evidentiary body that would prove these 30 counts of fraud.
Well, it's one of these things you can never say for sure until we see the indictment, but you can imagine that they're not going to go forward with this case unless they've got the building blocks to show this, not just through witnesses like Michael Cohen, but through those documents. And they're going to see things, I would imagine there's just, having done investigations like this where we built cases and instances of showed fraud by Donald Trump, you go to things like, if you have them, and we've had them in some instances when we've done our reporting, you look at bank records and you hopefully can get phone records and you can see the parties talking. You might not necessarily know what they're saying, but you can see the calls. Those not only are important, just say a baseline that calls were made, but then you can then match that up with what people are telling you. Did they make the call? Is there a record? And then you're going to look for text messages, not just between the principals involved, but also, did somebody leave a meeting and did they text their spouse? The old, you're not going to believe what happened at the office today. You're going to look for all that sort of stuff that builds to, in what we're looking at now being fraud. And we went through this in 2018 when we did the story that showed when Donald Trump inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from his father, he not only that happened, we examined that wealth, but we looked at how he enhanced it through tax fraud. We had all those sort of pieces that we were able to put together the case because we had so many records.
I mean, your investigation really is sort of the first investigation and the first financial documents investigation and the first tax fraud investigation that the public ever had the benefit and the privilege of seeing inside of. And I'm sure these investigators gleaned much from it. We know they did. We know from Mark Pomerantz's book that they did. Susanne Gregg and Andrew Weissmann, thank you so much. It's such a treat to get to talk to you guys today. Thank you very much for being so generous with your time. Andrew's got a lot more legal analysis and brilliance to share, and it is now part of, along with our good friend Mary McQuade, it is part of a new MSNBC podcast called Prosecuting Donald Trump. The latest episode drops at 6 p.m. tonight. Up next for us here, how low can the Republican Party go? With the leader of their party now indicted on criminal charges, the right flank has lined up behind him. We'll tell you what that looks like and what we have to worry about. Much more straight ahead. We ask the question all the time, how low can the Trump Republican Party go? Because it seems there is no bottom. And even though they don't know what they don't know, as Charlie Sykes just said, and the criminal charges against the ex-president are at this hour sealed, they are, as is to be expected, falling in line, united in seeming panic. Tucker Carlson, who, remember, according to those Dominion court filings, called Trump a, quote, demonic force. Well, last night, following the indictment, he riled up his millions of viewers with language like this, quote, probably not the best time to give up your AR-15, end quote. He said that. Then there's this outrageous tweet by a U.S. senator, top Trump ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, who on the night of January 6th said he was done with Donald Trump. Remember that? He said, it was fun, but I'm done. So last night, or today, he tweeted this, quote, how can President Trump avoid prosecution in New York? On the way to the DA's office on Tuesday, Trump should smash some windows, rob a few shops, and punch a cop. He would be released immediately, end quote. Lindsey Graham wrote that. And there's also loser Kari Lake with another tweet she can submit for her VP audition. It says this, quote, I don't know about you, but I have never supported Donald Trump more than I do at this moment. Charlie Sykes, this is such horse, you know what? They hadn't waned. I mean, to suggest that they're now what is the moon that's getting bigger, waxing because they'd waned is horse poop. I mean, they were all behind him. DeSantis is down 20 points in most polls. The notion that they're going to try to rattle Democrats by saying, oh, we were going to walk away and now we're not, is absolute lunacy, especially from the likes of Lindsey Graham and Kari Lake.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Lindsey Graham is going through some things. I mean, that tearful plea for money was extraordinary, even for Lindsey Graham, and then putting out those tweets suggesting that that Donald Trump should behave like Antifa or something. I think maybe it's a time for an intervention. But have you noticed that there is a kind of a thread among some of the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump folks on the right that you people are going to make us do this. You liberals, you never Trumpers and prosecutors, you're responsible for this. You're going to make us nominate and support Donald Trump again, as if they have no agency, as if it is not, their votes that are going to put him back in the nomination. But yes, the kind of reaction that you're seeing is well, I suppose it's predictable at this point. And, you asked the question of what is the bottom. So, I mean, we have Tucker Carlson talking about AR-15s. You have Kari Lake saying these things. But I also think people need to keep their eye on how far is Kevin McCarthy and the House Republicans willing to go to use their power to harass, intimidate, harass and intimidate the juries, the judge, and the prosecutor. How far will they go to aid and abet Donald Trump's attempt to obstruct justice? I mean, it's one thing for them to put out tweets or, bleats on social media. It's quite another thing to use the subpoena power of the House of Representatives as a cudgel against law enforcement officials. And by the way, if they're doing this in New York, they'll do it in Georgia, and they will do it with Jack Smith and the Department of Justice as well.
The Reverend Al Sharpton joins our coverage. He's the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and the president of the National Action Network. Rev, I mean, you know this better than any of us. Part of the reason Trump does it is because so far it has worked.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it has worked, and it has been something that he has succeeded at. But I think that they're going into a level now that is different than before. One, they do not even know what they're fighting. We have not seen the indictment unsealed. And let me tell you, I know Alvin Bragg. Alvin Bragg is the same district attorney, same Alvin Bragg, that a year ago would not proceed with the case. The only reason he would be proceeding now, from the Alvin Bragg I know, is that there has been new evidence, deeper situations that tells him they can win this case. And when this is unsealed on Tuesday, we may be talking about Stormy Daniels and other things. They've already committed themselves to something that they don't even know they're fighting. How do we know Weissmann has not given other information? How do we know there's not insurance fraud and other things involved in this case? We're told it's 30 counts. So this may be a lot more than just Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, and they've already hitched themselves into this ship that might be going down.
All right, there's another story I want to ask you about, Rev. We have to sneak in a quick break. We'll all be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So we live in a sacrifice zone. You're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
So back in 1989, Donald Trump, the citizen, took out ads calling for 5 Black and Latino teenagers, known as the Central Park Five, who were falsely accused of raping and beating a white woman who was jogging in Central Park, to be put to death. Flash forward to yesterday, one of those now exonerated men, Yusuf Salem, had this to say, quote, "For those asking about my statement on the indictment of Donald Trump, who never said sorry for calling for my execution, here it is. Karma." Rev, your thoughts?
Well, many of us that stood for those young men then were castigated, lampooned, and we stood for them. And it was proven by DNA later, after one of them did 13 years in jail, Corey Weiss, that they were not the ones that had, in fact, assaulted and raped this woman in Central Park. Even then, Donald Trump said that the city should not settle with them and that he felt they were guilty. This is after DNA evidence. So even if you could say that he had reason to believe, or that he sincerely believed in the beginning they were guilty, once the DNA evidence came out, he refused to retract and, in fact, kept advocating for that. The irony of that is that he will be arraigned in the same building they were arraigned in 1989, when some of us stood there and defended those young boys. And some of those young men now will be able to watch the one that wanted them to get the death penalty walk in the same building, have charges read like anyone else in the city of New York. It will be a full circle of where the justice system can sometimes take long, but will ultimately catch up.
So, Mike, your book is called Donald Trump versus the United States. And I remember the time it felt provocative to you. And it's not versus the United States, but it is Donald Trump versus New York. And as everyone has said today, we may very well be heading to Donald Trump versus Fulton County, Donald Trump versus the United States. Do you think we're at the beginning of something new for him?
Well, I mean, just to take all of the fact that I've only talked about baseball today, let's take it even further. At different points in the Trump story, as someone covering it, you thought, okay, we've sort of come to the end. And I wonder constantly, what inning of the Trump story are we in?
What do you think?
Are we maybe, I mean, if Donald Trump became president for a second time, we would only be maybe in the 4th inning of the Trump story. It certainly looks like there's a lot more to go. These criminal trials, it's not like he's going to go on trial this spring. That will drag out. You have these 2 other investigations, 3, I've lost track. So what inning of the Trump story are we in? And it just seems like there's a lot more to go.
It feels like those hellish, 18-inning games to me. The Rev, Charlie, Mike, thank you all so much for being here on an extraordinary day of news. Thank you so much. Still to come for us, it has taken 50 years from the first time investigators began looking into any of Trump's wrongdoing to where we are now with the first ever criminal indictment of an ex-president. Taking stock of all of it is where we start the next hour of coverage after a very short break today. Don't go anywhere.
This is somebody who has gotten away with pretty much everything for decades now, and he's never faced real accountability for any of it. And, much more serious crimes, from his racist rental practices back in the 70s and 80s to all sorts of shenanigans in Atlantic City to, of course, the big lie, the insurrection of January 6th, and on and on. So I have no doubt in my mind that those quotes are accurate, that he is having a very tough time grappling with any of this. And he may not actually believe it unless and until he's getting his mugshot and his fingerprints taken.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in Miami. It is a monumental moment that we're all living through together right now. An ex-president has been criminally charged, the first time that has happened in our country's history. Donald J. Trump has been indicted by a grand jury in Manhattan on charges connected to his hush money payments to Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 presidential election. As you just heard from the ex-president's niece, well, it's a moment that feels surreal to everybody watching. There is likely no one more shocked than Trump himself, because for half a century, Donald Trump has been getting away with skirting the law. The Washington Post reflects on his 50-year playbook. Quote, already Trump's statements about the Daniels case have followed a pattern he set as far back as 1973, when federal prosecutors accused Trump and his father, Fred, a prominent New York City apartment developer, of turning away black people who wanted to rent from them. In that case, Trump first denied the allegation. Then he said he didn't know his actions were illegal. And then, through a lawyer, accused the government of conducting a bogus Gestapo-like investigation. This time, Trump initially said he'd never had any sexual relationship with Daniels, or that, as he told friends privately, Daniels was not his type. Then he said he didn't know Daniels had been paid $130,000 to remain silent about their alleged relationship, which he denies existed. And then he said that perhaps he had known about that payment, but that he never ordered his attorney, Michael Cohen, to make it. New York Times is today reporting that Trump's team was caught off guard when the indictment announcement came down, and that in recent days, Trump has appeared significantly disconnected from the severity of his legal woes. Times adding this, quote, for all of Trump's outward confidence, the reality is that he has feared and avoided an indictment for more than 4 decades. He watched in horror as his former chief financial officer, Allen Weisselberg, surrendered to authorities. It was shown on television in 2021. Weisselberg is only slightly younger than Trump, who told aides he couldn't believe what they're doing to that man. Trump is expected to appear in court in New York for his arraignment on Tuesday. And if all this isn't enough for the disgraced, twice impeached, and now indicted ex-president, there are many other ongoing criminal investigations looming over him. There's Fulton County DA Fani Willis's probe and the 2 investigations led by special counsel Jack Smith. An indictment 50 years in the making is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times reporter Katie Benner is here. Also joining us, Bloomberg Opinion senior executive editor and Trump biographer Tim O'Brien joins us. Barbara McQuade is back, former U.S. attorney, now a law professor at the University of Michigan. And our friend John Heilemann's here, host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus and executive editor of The Recount. Tim O'Brien, you wrote one of my favorite things today, and I have read everything, but I want to read this from your piece. Quote, moments like this always remind me of the time that Trump screened Sunset Boulevard for me on his private jet about 20 years ago. I've trotted out this example before, but it's still useful. You might recall the plot. Gloria Swanson, a faded movie goddess herself, plays the silent film star Norma Desmond, outraged about being eclipsed by the arrival of the talkies. In one of the movie's most wrenching and uncomfortable scenes, she lets the world know she has no intention of fading away. Quote, those idiot producers, those imbeciles, haven't they got any eyes? Have they forgotten what a star looks like? I'll show them. I'll be up there again, so help me. As Desmond's resentment played out in front of us, Trump leaned over my shoulder to offer me some guidance. Is this an incredible scene or what, he whispered? Just incredible. Tim, of all the brilliant analysis that's been written today, that one just struck me as perhaps the best parallel we'll see.
Well, you know, for all of Donald Trump's administrations and positioning as a tough guy, at his core, he's a drama queen. And he loves being center stage. And he does not like being humiliated. And whatever course Alvin Bragg's prosecution takes and wherever this case winds up, on Tuesday morning, Donald Trump is likely to be arraigned, and he is going to be humiliated publicly in some fashion. And he dreads that. I think he was horrified watching Allen Weisselberg get perp walked and show up in handcuffs. He does not want that for himself. And I think we have to remind ourselves that it's a dangerous place for Trump to be in, because he's been able to weaponize the court system for decades to serve his own purposes. He has never really been fully held accountable in a courtroom. And he's now perilously close to all of that in a way that all of the tools that he had in the past, using attorney-client privilege to keep people at bay and wait and see tactics in courtrooms, those are beyond him now. And I think what he's going to do is he's going to lash out. He is not going to want anyone to think, one, that his star has faded, and then secondarily that he's impotent. And I think he is going to act in a way that we've seen before, which is to be incendiary and incite violence. And I think he's going to test institutions, and he's going to test American citizens' willingness to let institutions, even if they're flawed, particularly legal institutions, go about their work peacefully.
Katie, this seems to be, or at least we've ascribed this as top of mind for the Justice Department, and certainly going through obtaining court approval to search Mar-a-Lago and the subsequent attack on an FBI field office means it's not just a concern, it's a real threat. What Trump incites with his attacks on the institutions like the ones Tim is talking about, the Justice Department, law enforcement, any prosecutor investigating him. That said, the facts are not in dispute. Frankly, most of them exist on tape somewhere between Michael Cohen's recordings, filings that the Justice Department under Bill Barr has already submitted and put in black and white that Trump directed and coordinated a hush money scheme to benefit his 2016 candidacy. What do you make of the very real threat of violence from Trump's attacks on these institutions and the very solid body of evidence leading to this indictment?
I think that Donald Trump is going to use the silence coming from the prosecutors to his advantage, or at least he'll try to. So as Tim said, to incite violence, to deny that he's done anything wrong. We saw this with the Mueller investigation. Prosecutors are generally bound not to speak of their work. And so if a defendant wants, they can fill that void with whatever it is they want to say. Generally, that hasn't happened to the degree that it has with Donald Trump, but he is norm shattering. And so I don't think he's going to change course. And in filling that void, he will not only perhaps incite violence, which the FBI, the police in New York, they're anticipating. He'll also try to undermine the institutions of the United States. So this isn't really just a case about Donald Trump. It's a case that tests the larger system. If he is able to convince Americans that he is really being persecuted, that this is wrong, that this is political, that has broader ramifications for far longer than however it is that we see Donald Trump on the political stage. Plus, he has the machine of a political campaign. This is not just a man crying in the wilderness. He has cameras on him. He has reporters following him. He has people coming to rallies because he is an announced candidate for president. So he still doesn't have the levers of the federal government. He has the levers of what he knows best, which is the lever of attention, which he'll continue to keep on him and he will continue to try to use.
It's such an amazing image, John Heilemann, of a man crying in the wilderness. I mean, it kind of fits. You imagine him sort of bumping around Mar-a-Lago, crying in the wilderness there. But I take Katie's point that he's sort of he's in a role that he knows really well. I mean, he's back to, and you've covered him as brilliantly as anybody. He's candidate Trump again, facing adversity and what he will characterize as skeptics and doubters. The problem is, it's where all the heat is in the Republican Party. It's a smaller chunk of it. It's about 25% of the country. The other problem is the conversation that bookends the week that you and I had about where he launched his campaign in Waco. I mean, he's playing with bigger tools, sharper weapons, if you will, at a moment when he has sort of successfully both conditioned his supporters to only believe him and not believe facts as they lay out before their eyes, and at a point when his own criminality seems to be catching up with him. Where's your head sort of as this dramatic week comes to a close?
Well, first of all, happy Friday, Nicolle. It's quite a Friday.
Happy Friday.
I was thinking about yesterday when we got this indictment about, there are these things that happen in American history where people remember where they were, for the rest of their lives. People
yes,
remember
I saw that
they were of a certain
tweet
age.
You guys sent out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, when John Kennedy was killed, when man on the moon, 9/11, people, and this is not, it's interesting because, of course, on some level, this is not like that. Those are, epochal moments, and they were moments that, Pearl Harbor, those are moments that like every American experienced in somewhat the same way. This is a big moment that Americans, depending on their partisan affiliations and their ideological orientations, experience in a totally different way. But I do think that there are a few things to say about it that are important. And one of them is that, Donald Trump has faced adversity in the past. He's no stranger to litigation, as Tim knows. He's never been afraid of litigation. Most humans are afraid of, don't want to be involved in any lawsuit, don't want to talk to lawyers, don't want to ever be involved in a civil case, let alone a criminal case. But it really, you get these business people for whom litigation is just a cost of doing business. It's just a tactic. It's just a thing. He's done thousands of lawsuits, right, that he's been involved in. But he's never had this. And that famous Mike Tyson thing of everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. Getting charged with a criminal charge is just so different than anything else than you've ever experienced. And if you've ever had the unfortunate reality of having a pair of handcuffs around your wrists, or have ever been, faced the possibility of incarceration, of losing your freedom of movement, there's a reason why Trump's been afraid of that his whole life. But partly because he's flirted with criminality his whole life and has known that was always out there, but also because it is just the sanction that's beyond anything else. Money is just money. Time is just time. The possibility of being imprisoned, losing your freedom of movement, is a thing that does terrify almost everyone, and certainly it clearly terrifies Trump. And so the combination of him being finally put in this realm that he's feared for so long, at a moment when, to go back to your first point, rattling around kind of Mar-a-Lago in this kind of state where he's not, maybe, who knows, maybe he's worse than Richard Nixon when he was yelling at the paintings in the White House in 1974. But he's not, it's an unusual, it's a kind of pressure he's never faced before. He's been unhinged at various times in the past, but it feels different this time. And it's why this moment feels so combustible. And you add in one last thing, which is that, the first shoe to drop apparently is Stormy Daniels' stilettoed heel that's fallen on his head. But man, if you look at Washington, D.C., you look at the grand jury there, you look down in Georgia, it could be the beginning of a hailstorm of footwear that's going to be falling on Trump's head in these coming weeks. And he knows that. And he also knows that for those grand jurors, it's no longer unthinkable to indict a former president. It's gone from the unthinkable to the thinkable to the fact. It's now a thing that has been done. And anybody who sits on a grand jury anywhere else who's worried about, hey, do I want to be first? Do I want to vote for the first criminal indictment of a former United States president? They never have to think about that anymore. Now they're just thinking about the law. It's been done. And once it's been done, the game changes.
Yeah, and John, the game has changed as well for him as a candidate. I think that what we're seeing him face is the consequences stripped from the way he carried the presidency. He made no secrets of it. It's on us, not him, frankly, if it wasn't abundantly clear from the outside that he viewed DOJ as his personal law firm. Barr was his Tacopina, and the reason Sessions didn't make it is because he wasn't Tacopina-y enough. And the idea that now he is stripped from all of the protections that the presidency afforded, it should be abundantly clear, even to his own base of support, that the only reason he wants to go back is to insulate himself from legal exposure. How deep do you think that truth can penetrate into sort of Earth 2, where Trump supporters live?
I don't know, Earth 2. That's funny. I don't know how deeply it can penetrate. Man, we talked about this a little bit the other day. We were on Earth 3 when we were in Waco with Trump supporters, or Mars, some suborbital like moon on Mars. There's the reality of talking to those folks and hearing them say over and over again that they would never engage in violent protest. And you would say, but on January 6th. People just like you did. And they would say, to a person, no, we would never do that. It's Antifa and BLM, and it was not as bad as people think. And it's a conspiracy with the media. It's a conspiracy with the FBI. It is so deeply baked into Trump's support, which, again, we always want to put in context. It's not a majority of Americans by far. It's not, maybe not even a majority of Republicans, but it's a plurality. And it's those right. People are powerful politically in the Republican Party, and they're dangerous if they're incited outside that context. And so I don't think there's much chance that those people, the hardcore Trump supporters, are going to look up and go, yeah, Trump just wants to run for office, run for re-election so he can try to skirt the law again. I think they are going to believe that this is a giant cosmic conspiracy against him. Their belief in the deep state is only be magnified by this. And as I'll say again, it's why this is a moment, without being alarmist, it's a moment of great kind of tremulousness and a certain kind of lurking peril out there on the land.
Yeah, especially for those of us who call New York City home. I mean, it has very real security implications, what's going to happen next week. On that, we have some breaking news on that front from our colleague, NBC News investigative reporter Jonathan Dietz has some new reporting about the TikTok, exactly what we think will happen on Tuesday, how we think that will go. We reported earlier in the broadcast on the fact that he will arrive in New York Monday night. He will stay in New York City Monday night at Trump Tower. On Tuesday, he'll arrive at a downtown courthouse. He will not be handcuffed. There will be no holding cell for him. He'll go straight to the 15th floor courtroom where he will be fingerprinted. And as of now, there is no photo equipment in that room, so it's unclear right now if there will be a mugshot at all. All of it, of course, is subject to change, but this is our reporting that we have at this moment in terms of how Tuesday is expected to go. Barbara McQuade, it sounds like some accommodations are being made. This is what justice looks like for most people, with some accommodations given who he is.
Yeah, and I don't know that this is necessarily giving him breaks because he's the former president so much as maybe accommodating the wishes of the Secret Service team that is there to protect
some security,
him.
Right.
For example, if he, like most people, walked into the courthouse up the steps, you can imagine the kind of crowd that's going to be there, from the press to protesters to counter-protesters to supporters. His life could be in danger, as could the lives of everybody who's there. And so my guess is to avoid that sort of spectacle, even if Donald Trump himself might want it as a way to claim the mantle of victimhood and grievance, my guess is Secret Service is going to overrule that and want to bring him in through the Sally Port, where they bring in prisoners, so that the public doesn't see him walking into the courthouse like that. And that, to the extent the public sees him, he'll be in the courtroom. We won't see him walk through the building because of just concerns about the safety of the former president, as well as everybody else in that building.
Barbara McQuade, what are your thoughts? I mean, this news broke almost exactly 24 hours ago. Right now, as we were coming on the air at 5 o'clock, we were prepared to talk about something else, and we were keeping an eye on Alvin Bragg's investigation and grand jury, but we didn't know it would come yesterday. I think John and Katie have kind of laid out the landscape, the country. It's a little more battered than it was before he came on the political landscape. And I think Tim really brings home just how psychologically impaired Trump is as a narcissist who only sees things in terms of his role in everything. How does all of that influence what Bragg does next?
Well, I think that if you're Alvin Bragg, you have a very difficult job. And the decision he has made so far is one that I think is a very good decision, which is no president is above the law. No person is above the law. And when you hear people like Donald Trump and Mike Pence and Governor DeSantis saying things like this is un-American or this is outrageous, they haven't even seen the charges yet. What they're really saying is it's outrageous that a former president is being treated like everybody else. So I think it's a really important moment that we have confirmed for Americans that a president is not above the law and should be treated just like anybody else. I think that's really important. The other thing I would say about this is Alvin Bragg is a smart prosecutor. He's a shrewd prosecutor. He is not going to go forward with a case like this unless he believes every T is crossed and every I is dotted. I imagine that he has spent the past 14 months since Mark Pomerantz walked off this case making sure every detail of his evidence was buttoned down, putting in more witnesses into the grand jury, reviewing documents, making sure everything Michael Cohen had to say could be corroborated by some other independent evidence. And so my guess is as he goes forward, he is going to continue to try to do things by the book to avoid the kind of second guessing that is going to come, because Donald Trump is going to fight this with everything he's got.
Katie Benner, we had a lot of great reporting from you and your colleagues about how closely the Merrick Garland Justice Department watched the 1-6 Select Committee, especially its public presentation of witnesses and evidence. Do you have any insight into how closely they've watched the cases in New York City or Fulton County, Georgia?
Well, they're watching this case closely for a couple of practical reasons, including just the fact that the federal government might be called in to help quell unrest. So, of course, they have to keep their eye on this. And then, they're, of course, looking at what happens with Donald Trump, how he responds to this, and what the charges are in and of themselves. It would be horrible if the case wasn't strong. I think that Barb is hopefully correct, that you wouldn't bring a weak case against somebody like Donald Trump, somebody with this profile where it's this controversial. But I don't think that they're looking to Alvin Bragg to give them permission to act. But it's more just needing to monitor a situation that, practically speaking, for the Justice Department, which oversees the FBI, is one that they may have to intervene in.
Tim, I'm coming back to your piece, and I just want to ask you one more question. As a candidate, Trump loved to cheer the people carrying out violence. He said, we'll hire you lawyers when he was at his rallies to defend people that punched other people. He's made his enthusiasm for what was happening on January 6th clear through the people like Pat Cipollone who've testified and Cassidy Hutchinson who've said he won't call them off because he doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. At a moment where you would think anybody in public life could participate in protecting innocent people. I mean, anyone that gets caught up in violence is innocent, and they're a victim of that spontaneous violence. What do you think people should be prepared for in terms of trying to imagine the unimaginable, in terms of Trump's capacity and appetite for people to do things in honor or in the notion that they're defending him or doing what they think he wants?
Well, Nicolle, remember after the 2020 election when he lost, and I think I was on your show a number of times in the period between that moment and January 6th, and there was this question there about what would Trump do next. And I think I said at the time that I think he will burn the house down. I don't know what shape that will take, but he's not just going to accept the fact that Joe Biden defeated him. And he would rather see the world around him burn than to tell the public that he's a loser or that he didn't get what he wanted. That's just how he is built. It's baked into who he is. It comes from this deep well of insecurity and need. And he's willing to sow chaos and dissent. Trumpism itself is built on I think, essentially weaponizing racism and class resentment. In the pursuit of power. So he's been toying with this venom for a long time. I think we saw on January 6th his willingness to simply open the gates to physical violence in order to stop a vote being tallied that would mean that he lost an election. So here we are now with him going to make an appearance in a courtroom in Manhattan and getting a mugshot taken. And it's essentially going to be the first chapter in, I think, months and months, if not years, of a legal tar pit that he's going to have to slog his way through. And he is not going to go gently through any of that. What shape that takes in terms of violence, I don't know. I couldn't have predicted January 6th before it happened. But he has posted a photo of himself next to Alvin Bragg with a baseball bat. Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted earlier today, we are all going to march up to New York on Tuesday. Join me, essentially, was her tweet. So he has very vocal acolytes around him that are essentially saying, let's take to the streets. And I think we have to take that literally and prepare ourselves for it. And what it means at the end of the day, I think, is what are all of us as average Americans and as members of one community that's split by dissent and Trump going to do to resist those kind of calls?
Katie Benner, Tim O'Brien, Barbara McQuade, no better people to make sense of this moment. Thank you so much for starting us off. Heilemann sticks around. When we come back, one of the people who has tried to hold the ex-president accountable for his conduct, former lead counsel for the first impeachment of Donald Trump, now Congressman Dan Goldman, will be our guest to discuss what news of Trump's indictment means for the rule of law in America. And later in the program, a call by Marjorie Taylor Greene to protest Tuesday, as Tim was just talking about, at Trump's arraignment, is renewing fears that the indictment of Donald Trump will lead to violence. We'll talk about that. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
This is Chris Hayes from MSNBC. The Manhattan grand jury voted to indict Donald Trump, setting a new precedent for holding American leaders accountable. But how do you convince a jury to convict a former president? On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, MSNBC legal contributors Andrew Weissmann and Mary McQuade, two of the most well-respected prosecutors in the country, break down what's next from a prosecutor's perspective. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening right now and follow.
Our next guest, former lead impeachment counsel and current member of Congress, Dan Goldman, writes that Trump's position as a former president and current presidential candidate, or his and his supporters' reaction to the charges, should not matter when it comes to the law. He writes this, quote, "We know Donald Trump does not believe in the rule of law, as I helped to demonstrate 4 years ago. If we are to preserve our democracy, our justice system cannot allow itself to be intimidated when anyone, former president or otherwise, threatens mob violence to undermine the rule of law. We cannot let anyone get away with unduly attacking a prosecutor in an effort to interfere with or obstruct an ongoing criminal prosecution. And we cannot pretend that this case or any other can be settled in the political arena. Our democratic system of government hinges on our fealty to the rule of law. Responsible elected officials should support that system rather than try to tear it down out of fealty to one man." Democratic Congressman Daniel Goldman of New York is our guest. John Heilemann is still here and is going to get in on the questioning. But my question for you, Congressman, we've had a lot of conversations going back to before you were in that body about how when it comes to Donald Trump, there's almost this igloo or some impermeable bubble around him where Republicans in the two impeachments didn't dispute the facts as were presented by impeachment managers in either instance. But there was no appetite to doing what you write about, to protecting and preserving the rule of law for the rest of us, for any future president of either party who commits crimes, as Donald Trump seemed to be increasingly emboldened to do every time he got away with the one before. I wonder if you can articulate, having sat sort of inside both branches, inside, the working in SDNY and working on the impeachments, just put the stakes of getting this right into words for us.
Well, it is very important. It is something that whether we say everyone is equal or not, which everyone is under the law, the stakes are higher when you are charging for the very first time a former president. What I am really alarmed by is the rush to judgment and the accusations hurled at a prosecutor by people who have not seen the indictment, who have no idea what the evidence is. And that, to me, is incredibly partisan. And it is this weird fealty to Donald Trump, not only by his cultish followers, but also by House Republicans in particular, who are now doing the legal bidding for Donald Trump. And Trump's lawyer asked them to do it, and they did it the next day to try to interfere in an ongoing prosecution. And it can't just be that they're afraid of the wrath of Donald Trump. But I do believe that they see his path and the way that he has emerged as a path to power. And that is everything to this Republican Party, to Speaker McCarthy, and to the others who are trying to interfere in a state-level prosecution.
Hey, Dan, it's Heilemann here. Let me stick with this point you're making. You know, one of the things we saw in some of the, particularly in the Roger Stone case during the Mueller investigation, was that when Roger Stone started doing provocative things on social media, ultimately the judge shut him down and put severe constraints on what he was able to do in public. I guess my question for you is, and we had you on the circus last week, and we kind of raised this possibility when you saw that tweet or that social truth social, whatever that thing is, post that Trump put up with the baseball bat and Bragg, you suggested, hey, they should take that to the judge and either charge him, but if not charge him, that should become material if this indictment goes forward. Is there a world in which Trump could be, and as he now enters this realm that he's unfamiliar with, criminal procedure. Is there a world where he could be held accountable for those incendiary and inciting those tweets meant to provoke incitement? Could he be held accountable and told that he can't use that platform, that he can't speak that way, or else he'll face sanctions in court?
Absolutely. And it would happen after the arraignment when the judge sets whatever bail conditions. Everyone fully expects Donald Trump to get out on bail or get out on his own recognizance, since the Secret Service certainly knows where he is. But if he continues with that kind of behavior, if he continues to threaten the prosecutor or threaten the judge, the first thing I would expect would be a gag order, which would say that under court order, Donald Trump cannot say anything about the case. The chances of him abiding by that are next to zero. So then it will escalate. And the question becomes, how many times will he violate a gag order before a judge starts to restrict his liberty in some ways? And there are gradual ways of ramping that up prior to him going to jail, being remanded pre-trial. But once you're under the supervision of a court, it's very different than when you are in an impeachment proceeding or when you are under investigation, because there are rules, there are laws, and Donald Trump is not used to following the norms, the rules, and the law, but he will have to do so once he is a defendant in a court.
Dan, the attacks on Alvin Bragg coming from House Republicans, are part of a pattern. Republicans don't do anything one time and in one place. Prosecutors are under attack in Georgia by Republicans there. And I wonder what you think, or whether there's an effort to push back in the other direction that is national in scope, to push back against Republicans really taking on prosecutors, deciding that the rule of law is always political in their view. And if the target of an investigation is Donald Trump, it is always an unjust one. What is the pushback, and has it been organized?
Well, this has been a long-running theme with Donald Trump, which is that he, more than perhaps any other politician that we've seen in recent history, has politicized everything. John mentioned the Roger Stone case. He politicized the Roger Stone case. He politicized the Mueller investigation. He politicized the entire Department of Justice, and he weaponized that department for his own benefit. When Roger Stone made some indications that he had information about Donald Trump immediately gave him a pardon, essentially. And he used his power over the Department of Justice in a way that no president has ever done before, since Nixon at least, where there's a real divide. But his politicization of absolutely everything, including our military assistance to Ukraine, our Department of Justice, these things that used to be very separate from the political arena, has now infected, I think, the entire Republican Party. And that's why everyone is jumping to this notion that this is a partisan prosecution, when you have a prosecutor who rejected his own line prosecutor's recommendation to indict Donald Trump a year ago. And they lauded him and they praised him and they talked about how virtuous he was. Now, a year later, when he's deciding to follow the facts and the law to pursue charges against him, they call him the greatest partisan prosecutor ever. Well, you can't have it both ways. And that hypocrisy just underscores the fact that there is no basis for this. This is the politicization of our criminal justice system. And Alvin Bragg is taking the view that I don't care about whether it's political or not. I am going to follow the facts and the evidence without fear or favor.
Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today. We're grateful. Up next for us, dangerous rhetoric and calls for violence are surging as the twice impeached, now indicted ex-president, connected to the threat of domestic violent extremism, takes this next step, enters this new arena. We'll bring you that reporting next. It won't surprise any of you to learn that the ex-president's closest allies came to his vigorous defense last night after it was revealed that he would be indicted. The striking thing, though, is this insidious part about coalescing the party around Trump is the coalescing around the conspiracy theories and the permission structure it is creating for violence. 2 weeks ago, Trump loyalist Marjorie Taylor Greene said that the ex-president's supporters shouldn't support what was at the time a looming indictment. She said she would not travel to New York, but in a complete reversal, as has been mentioned on this broadcast, Greene tweeted earlier today to her audience of more than 600,000 followers on Twitter that in fact she is going to New York on Tuesday to protest what she calls the unconstitutional witch hunt. Marjorie Taylor Greene's call to protest comes at the same time that pro-Trump accounts have been actively peddling conspiracy theories about just why Trump was indicted. Doesn't mention hush money. It talks about this bizarre theory that you may not have heard of if you don't spend time down the right-wing rabbit holes. It goes like this: George Soros is behind it all. It made it onto Fox News last night, thanks to Matt Gaetz.
It seems to leave a nation on the edge as we witness the Sorosification of the criminal justice system in this country. Remember, Soros gave Alvin Bragg $1 million. We will wake up in a very different America tomorrow because we can no longer have moral authority against the dictators and despots who would always find it easier to jail their political rivals than to compete against them in free and fair elections.
It's such a joke. It's hard to figure out where to begin dismantling that for accuracy. So we're going to call in reinforcements. Joining our conversation, NBC News senior reporter Ben Collins, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence, and MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi. Heilemann is still here. Let me just, because I've got almost like a reflexive itch to correct the record, let me just explain to anyone who's lost right now how George Soros figures into any of this. This is from the New York Times. Exaggerated accounts of the connections between Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney overseeing the case, and George Soros, the Democratic mega donor, continued to spread. Representative Paul Gosar, Republican from Arizona, wrote on the social network Gab that Bragg was a Soros DA, although a spokesman for Mr. Soros has said he's never met Mr. Bragg nor donated directly to his campaign. Mr. Soros donated $1 million to the political arm of Color of Change, a progressive criminal justice group that endorsed Mr. Bragg. Threats directed at Mr. Bragg and Mr. Soros peppered online discussions of the indictment, including claims that people were watching Mr. Bragg's house and children, appeals for Trump supporters to, quote, pick up your rifles, end quote, and posts asking when is go time. Ben Collins, what is going on the right in America today?
Man, Nicolle, I feel like I have deja vu from before the midterms of 2018, because that's when Robert Bowers, a lunatic on Gab, that same exact website, was posting about how George Soros was funding the migrant caravan. And the migrant caravan was coming in because of the Great Replacement theory. They had to replace all the whites in America. So he went and shot up a synagogue in 2018. And then, a few days later, Cesar Sayoc, the MAGA bomber who sent these badly made pipe bombs to people, he sent them to George Soros. And he constantly posted these ideas that George Soros paid off the children inside of Parkland, the school that was shot up. So this is a long-running conspiracy theory. It's been going on for 2 decades. I really recommend, by the way, Emily Tampkin's book about George Soros, about what he actually does, which he does, in fact, send around a lot of dark money to a lot of different places for a lot of different things. That is a different discussion. That is a campaign finance discussion, which I think we should probably have. But it is not this discussion. This is a completely different discussion. This is a guy, Donald Trump was indicted on real charges that we're all going to see together. It has nothing to do with this George Soros stuff, which has been a dog whistle on the right for the last 20 years.
Frank Figliuzzi, unfortunately, you are often our first call when the disinformation and the conspiracy theories reach an unstable person or a particularly agitated person who shoots up the homes, as happened in New Mexico this year, or who tries to harm Speaker Pelosi and badly injures her husband, Paul Pelosi. I mean, the problem is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a country with plenty of people who see an increasingly vibrant permission structure to act on these violent conspiracies.
Yeah, this is what the mantra we hear from the far right and the GOP MAGA stalwarts is, hey, listen, we can't possibly anticipate the activities of and reactions of unstable people to our rhetoric. We didn't mean it. Those people have mental illness. Therefore, there's no culpability here. The problem is we can draw straight lines between the people like you just mentioned and Ben just mentioned. Bad things happen when this kind of dangerous rhetoric and conspiracy theories are spouted. And the facts, the fact is you recited, George Soros never met Alvin Bragg. He didn't donate directly to Alvin Bragg. They don't want to hear those. And for people out there who are prone to violence and incited to violence, and again, we've seen the record of it, this is what happens. And what concerns me from a security perspective, in terms of the microcosm of the eventual trial in New York City is, not only have these folks lashed out against the DA, Alvin Bragg, but now today we see lashing out against this judge, again, making stuff up about the judge forcing Weisselberg into a deal. Judges don't do that. We're going to see that. And then what? The line prosecutors whose names are probably going to be identified on the indictment when it's unsealed? What about the jurors? New York State does not allow fully anonymous juries like the federal system does. What about the risk to the jurors? Are they going to be lashed out at? This is the concern. It's building, building, building.
All right, I want to ask you about both those things. We have to sneak in a quick break. John and Ben and Frank and I will be back on the other side of it. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So when you live in a sacrifice zone, you're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back with Ben, Frank, and John. Frank, I want to come back to you on the point you were making about the judge and the jury. Our colleague has already reported about the details of that day. It seems that Donald Trump is being treated with respect, that respect is not being reciprocated to Alvin Bragg's office or the process. What and how quickly could the consequences be for Trump?
Yeah, I don't think from what I hear about this judge that there's going to be much tolerance for anything that sounds like it's inciting violence, particularly ad hominem attacks on the judge, the DA, the line prosecutors, or the jurors particularly. The problem is enforcing that. So even if we see a gag order in terms of not speaking about the case, I'm not confident Trump can follow that. And then we're, it's kind of a Roger Stone situation. Then we're into an admonition and then even potentially the threat of a contempt charge. And I would caution, and I'm sure the lawyers don't have any penetration into Trump's head here, but I would caution them that anything he's going to say that sounds like it's inciting violence, Jack Smith, his worry is not just that it gets charged in New York, but Jack Smith's listening. Jack Smith's looking at the inciting of violence on January 6th. And it's potential that it would be admitted into evidence in the eventual federal charges, if there are any, regarding violence on January 6th. Here's a man who actually still wants to hit the DA with a baseball bat or projects an image of that, still calls the DA an animal, still, says whatever he's going to say. That is potential evidence to mindset and past acts with regard to future charges of inciting violence on January 6th.
And John Heilemann, we've heard from both ends of it, both the inciter in Donald Trump and the incited in the form of insurrectionists who testified in the January 6th committee, Mr. Stephen Ayers, who said that once Trump told him to leave, he left. I mean, it's been established, this call and answer from Trump to his base.
Yeah, and as part of why the stuff from last week that continues now, Nicolle, is so disturbing. It's I keep thinking about Soros, who you started this conversation with. Trump last week hammering the notion of Bragg being a Soros-backed animal, and you heard the House Republicans say it. You heard people say it on the ground in Waco when I was down there. It's a great twofer there, racist and anti-Semitic all rolled into one. And I always think about Soros. He's become, in the world of conspiracy theories, there is no more kind of totemic case than George Soros, and that is a story that is largely about anti-Semitism. There's a lot more to say about it, but man, that man has become the focus for so much unhinged stuff on the right, including people who will tell you over and over again that a Holocaust survivor who helped bring down communism in Central Europe, that man is himself a Nazi. I heard that all weekend last weekend.
It's insane. I mean, to Ben's point, it sounds like we need more time on this conversation. We'll make that time next week. To all of you, thank you. Ben Collins, Frank Figliuzzi, John Heilemann. We will be right back. Believe it or not, there is more breaking news to tell you about. A new ruling in that $1.6 billion lawsuit against Fox News. The judge in this case has shut down Fox News' attempt to get Dominion's suit thrown out. That means this case is set to go to trial 2 weeks and 3 days from today. That does it for us during this extraordinary week of news.
Hey everybody, it's Hoda Kotb and Jenna Bush Hager, and we got big news, y'all. Our show is now a podcast.
That's right. You can take us anywhere you go, in your car, to the gym, even just at home on your own couch with a glass of wine.
We like spending time with each other, and now we love that we can spend even more time with you. Are you sick of us yet?
Yeah, don't be, because you can never have to miss a moment of fun, laughs, or friendship.
Yeah, subscribe. Listen to Today with Hoda and Jenna wherever you get your podcasts.